I'm very happy to welcome you here today, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk about climate with us. My name is Ellie Siavkidu. I am the Director of Insights and Innovation at Black Sun in my second month, and I have joined the team feeling very excited as we are building our sustainability proposition and our list of services and products to clients. Maybe just a few introductory notes from me. Next slide, please. I'm sure you all saw the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that sort of called everyone to take urgent action. For those of you who have not sort of kept up with the latest publications that they have been quite sort of intense in sharing the information that basically we are deviating from the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios and the 2015 Paris Agreement. And we're running towards the 2 degrees scenario. So I think the latest report, which was published a couple of days ago, really just increased the urgency on that, saying that we have a small window for adaptation, but it's closing rapidly. So I suppose before we set off, and from my point of view, I think it would be great and would be really important for all of us today to sort of just take a moment and think about what can we do as companies, as corporates, as brands to accelerate change and to spark positive change. And to be much more sort of dynamic in our climate scenarios, in our transition plans, much more specific, and not necessarily wait for regulators or for governments. The private sector is here to play a very important role, and it seems to me that the climate crisis makes that more obvious than ever. Back to our agenda, of course. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a brief introduction to Black Sun for those of you who do not know us. And then my colleagues, Elia Barbieri, who's our senior strategist, will take us through the regulatory landscape and the latest developments. And James Whittingham, Sustainability Director, will go through some key themes and key actions that we feel are very important for companies to take. Based on a roundtable client event we had and research that we have been doing. And there will be a Q&A question at the end, but please feel free to use the chat to add any comments or questions. Finally, housekeeping. The meeting is being recorded and we will be sharing the link afterwards to those who were not able to participate today, but also to all of you if you want to go back and look at something. Next slide, please. A few words about Black Sun. We are a company that has been going around for more than 40 years. We're a global group of strategic advisors, consultants. We have design, account management teams, digital teams. And we very much come from a position where we believe that brands and corporates and business can and should have an active role in our society in sparking positive change and being part of the solution. Of course, the world 40 years ago was a much different world than the one today, but it seems that we were ahead in thinking that you cannot some of the sustainability transitions and generally changes that are happening in the world cannot just be left to regulators and governments, but you need companies to be leading the way. Next slide, please. So we are a team of over 150 people, and we cut across different locations. And what we have always followed is an in-depth sort of an research and advisory-led approach. We spend a lot of time trying to understand client needs, mapping the landscape and understanding the challenge that they face, and we try to offer solutions based on that insight and research that we conduct. Overall, next slide, please. We partner with clients, so we try to have long-term relationships, as we also believe this is the only way that we can actually bring change, and they can also see sort of the fruits of the labors and the efforts that they're trying to do as they try to be sort of more sustainable and more responsible in their approach. So we tend to have sort of long-term relationships and partnerships. This is some of the blue chip companies that we tend to work together with. And these also relationships allows us to build our in-house knowledge and then transform and sort of, again, lead these companies back and offer more innovative solutions as we move and we deepen our relationship. Next slide, please. This is sort of a visual of our proposition. So we have always worked towards the goal of creating value not just for shareholders, but also for the wider stakeholders, communities, consumers, regulators, even policymakers, and the wider societies and NGO. And we have adopted that sort of stakeholder approach very early on. And we partner that with sort of tools on a digital transformation. And of course, now we have a dedicated sustainability section that focuses both on ESG and sustainability strategy, materiality assessments, and all of that. Next slide, please. These are some of the publications. Please go to our website. It is quite rich in blogs, in analysis, and of course, many of you must be aware of the ongoing publication that we had for 17 years, the Complete 100, where we sort of follow the trends of corporate reporting over the last 2 decades. And I think with that, I will pass over to to Leah, to walk us through the regulatory landscape.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ellie. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Jumping straight into regulation. So some of the trends that we see in climate reporting is definitely that companies need to evidence increasingly how they are engaging with climate risks and opportunities. And some of the things that we've seen, it's also the Global Risks Report. It has been around for many years. It has been ranking climate change, climate impact as one of the big risks that we're facing globally. And this year report is no different. It definitely scores climate environmental degradation as one of the main risks that we are facing. And to be part of the solution, definitely companies need to start having climate transition plans, which is going to be one of the topics that we'll be covering today. Also, interesting to see that a PwC study surveyed in more than 100 countries, covering more than 4,000 CEOs. The opinion of CEOs globally is that more than 40% thinks that their organizations will no longer be economically viable. And this is because of the impacts that climate change might have in their supply chains, but also the cost profile of companies. In terms of the UK, it's interesting to see that not only we have now a net zero strategy that is looking to respond onto how to achieve the net zero ambition to actually achieve the greenhouse gas emissions by zero by 2050. And this was also informed by a January 2023 review of how could this be achieved. What are the risks? What are the roles that company can play? For example, in how can they use better infrastructures or actually bring more energy efficiency to homes? And next slide, please. Also, we are informed by science that climate change needs to be tackle to also try and not to increase global temperature by 1.5 degrees. And one of the great reports that we have so far is the IPCC report. It has been around for 5 years, and this year we have the 6th report that highlights how current status and trends of climate change are, what are the long-term climate and development futures, and also the near-term responses in climate change. So one of the big outcomes of this report is definitely that it's not impossible to reach the 2 degrees, but that companies in a way also need to have more robust scenario planning. The companies that are using stress tests or even a sensitivity analysis, we need to have more ambitious scenarios to actually tackle the fact that emission levels need to be reduced at least 43% by 2030. So there is a big focus on how are we increasingly, how we're going to be more ambitious in tackling our GHG emissions. Next slide, please. Some of the trends we then see in reporting, how are then businesses addressing these challenges? We definitely see further integration of sustainability in annual reports when not already covered in a standalone sustainability report. It's great to see that there's more and more mature TCFD reporting patterns. So we are seeing more than just a disclosure table. We can see pages dedicated to how are companies addressing climate risks and climate opportunities. And definitely we see more and more pathways to net zero being covered. So companies going above and beyond the just commitments that they are setting, but also defining targets and specific steps to achieve those. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the regulatory changes, if we're looking at the landscape, TCFD is definitely now a requirement in the UK. So companies, the companies that are in scope that need to report their climate risks and opportunities. If we were to think that both disclosures on TCFD are potentially GRI, we know that GRI is not a piece of legislation. It is indeed ESG. They have ESG standards. If we were to think that there is some level of preparedness that companies can have to respond to climate transition plans or even regulation, these are two frameworks that could actually help. And then from a European perspective, we also have the EU taxonomy that asks companies to classify their economic activities according to the environmental goals of the European Union, also CSRD from a non-financial reporting point of view, and how, for example, ISSB, also a global framework of reporting, is built from TCFD, from SASB, from GRI, and how all of these frameworks will help companies face the regulatory changes. TNFD, interestingly, there are expectations to become TCFD, but in this case, focusing on biodiversity and nature-related risks. So the way companies are responding to regulatory changes will help then also define the success, so to say, of their climate reporting. Next slide, please. One of the frameworks that is now on the table is actually the Transition Plan Task Force. If we were to think that TCFD also began as a group setting up standards and principles to report against, the TCFD, the Transition Plan Task Force, it now has 2 years mandate to develop disclosure framework and implementation. It was open for consultation until February this year. And we will see more and more companies responding to this framework, knowing that this is built again from TCFD and ISSB. Next slide, please. The goal of the Transition Plan Task Force is to actually bring transparency and bring more commitment from companies to just disclose commitments about achieving net zero, but also what is the strategy behind it? What are the policies that definitely back up the steps that companies are taking to then achieve these net zero commitments? And what are the targets? What is the governance structure that supports this decision? Next slide, please. I will then head over to James to actually see how some of our clients are tackling these challenges.
Thank you, Leah, and good morning and good afternoon to wherever you are joining us from today. So part of the reason for convening this webinar was to share with you, those in attendance, some of the key themes, the dialogue, the conversations that took place at our in-person client roundtable that we hosted here at our London office in early February. And so what I've got initially is just a flavor, and obviously we operated under Chatham House rules. So all of these quotes are obviously unattributable to those clients who kindly gave their time in person at that event. But what comes across is a real flavor across the board from those different companies. And we had companies from all different types of sectors, sort of industrial, financial, retail, so a real broad range. And certainly one of the key takeaways from this is that there is a real increasing workload inbox or in tray for sustainability practitioners particularly, but also for other preparers of corporate climate information ready for disclosure. So if I was to pick out a couple that really did resonate, one of them is around the speed of transition that is expected, both in terms of the speed of the net zero transition, but also the speed of being able to prepare that information for scrutiny, both internal and subsequently external, when it is to be publicized. But also that granularity, that real focus. So perhaps if those of you who've been working in the sector as long as the last decade or so, you may remember the mandatory carbon reporting requirements from 2013, and that is obviously subsequently evolved into SDCR, the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting Requirements, and then somewhere interspersed with that is ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. So all of this really has just created management focus and management time that perhaps wasn't previously there in the previous decade. So hence that remark from somebody who said, my board is now starting to expect these monthly ESG updates on key KPIs. So preparers of this information have got not only to satisfy the needs of external reporting, but also internal scrutiny and insight as well. So, you know, a lot of conversation was around that. If we go to the next slide, please, we've got some more remarks from people. So interestingly, some people are still grappling with their data and the fact that some of that scope 3 is, you know, that is really quite challenging still for lots of organizations, but we know that there is going to be increased focus and scrutiny on that in due course, not least because of some of the frameworks and standards that Leah mentioned. Somebody said that they were still surprised how manual ESG data collection is. And there was even an increasing demand for live data because of the sort of 24/7, the speed of the focus, etc. But also there was a question about, do we have the sufficient resources? Do we have the right capabilities at present? And if not, does the business need to really get on and invest accordingly? So we do have the right skill set and capabilities for what is still quite a fast moving environment. And it's no secret that the jobs market in sustainability and climate change still is running pretty hot, as there is this sort of war on talent to get people with the right skill sets, the right capabilities to help their companies tell a joined up, articulate, competent story on all things climate and by extension sustainability related. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what sort of shook out of this were 5 key themes from the roundtable discussion, and we started with 5 questions. But in fact, and we've mentioned TCFD this morning, but TCFD, because it's been around for at least a couple of years, there's been a couple of rounds now of mandatory disclosure in your annual report. It wasn't one of the areas that people wanted to talk about. It was data and organization and being joined up, and capacity and capability was some of the key themes that came across. So what we've got is just a few slides to share with you about some of the key themes that came out of that session, and also some of our viewpoints, and all which relate to being sort of tips about how you might best prepare for this sort of avalanche of new requirements and regulations around climate and reporting. So obviously, I've already mentioned about there is this demand from both internal and external stakeholders. And I spent 15 years in-house as a practitioner, so I know about being at the sort of in the spotlight with regards to the increased focus on data and the quality of that information that needs to be improved. Obviously, more and more companies now have got an ESG or a sustainability steerco or committee that has often got quite high prominence because of its reporting lines, often to another dedicated board committee. And so there is a greater expectation about the frequency of that information, the granularity, and the the better quality data that is required. So that pressure is speeding up. As more and more stakeholders are expecting more credible plans. And I guess, as Leah mentioned before, with the latest IPCC report, companies need to have a competent, coherent, joined up story when it comes to climate disclosure and climate reduction plans. So we go to the next slide or next element. Thank you. So one of the points that we made in our white paper that we published on the back of the roundtable were, just start collecting your data as early as possible, whether that be in the financial year or if you are embarking on this journey for the first time. Understand and start to sketch out what it is you need so that you can actually meet some of your deadlines. Depending upon the nature of your business, you may be subject to other schemes that you have to abide by. So the end of this year is the next deadline for ESOS. That's the end of December 23. So there's a deadline there, and obviously ESOS data is generally around calendar year. But you as a business, you may have a different reporting year to the UK calendar year or even fiscal year. So the more regularly and the more frequently you collect your data, the more easily it's manipulable and can be cut, sliced and diced to meet and fit the different reporting boundaries. Obviously, stating the obvious perhaps, unless you're really starting out in this journey, about having a baseline, putting those processes in place, and then starting to increase the robustness of that data. And one of the things I really remember from being in-house for that length of time working FTSE 100 organizations is that as a sustainability practitioner, particularly, you get a chance to really feel your way around, to meet and speak to different people, and you've got carte blanche to actually get and gather this data because you need it increasingly, obviously, for mandatory requirements. I, for many years, a decade or more ago, was still using Excel, but there are a lot of products on the market now that can help you speed up, improve the veracity and the quality of that data to really let it be held up to scrutiny. But it's obviously important to engage in best practice conversations, both internally, through professional membership organizations, for example, and also perhaps your audit partner that you might work with in terms of what's going on to be able to keep up to date, because it is very fast moving. And as we showed you before, transition plans, consultation ended 28th February, and we expect publication of their latest, of their guidelines and guidance in the summer, which happens to coincide with the guidelines that we're expecting from the ISSB with regards to their 2 exposure standards as well on climate and sustainability reporting more broadly. So you can expect quite a lot of content being shared in the summertime. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. So accurate data, still challenging to find, particularly when we come to scope 3. And this really did resonate from the conversation that we facilitated, as I said, at that roundtable event. So scope 3 is more challenging, it is more nuanced. There is definitely help that you can get out there from specific agencies, because it is a really detailed piece of work to undertake. And that's really important when you start to map out your net zero plans, your transition plans, not least because often it's the scope 3 that will be the lion's share of your footprint. But it's that sort of inverse relationship between it's generally more complicated and complex to actually to acquire and get your head around. There is still an issue around data being based on assumptions and models, and that is that's understandable. And there's this sort of internal tension sometimes between sustainability practitioners, financial professionals in an organization, and that there's sort of some head scratching about that this sustainability data is not yet in a place that it's quite as robust as financial data. And obviously we've been doing, double-sided or bookkeeping, debits and credits for almost millennia, whereas sustainability and climate specifically data is really only very, very new. I mean, obviously, there's still debate around methodologies. One size will definitely not fit all, but there's a lot of useful methodologies out there, particularly, obviously, with regards to DEFRA. Okay, if we go to the next part of this slide, thank you. So I think the conclusion that we drew from that conversation, it's better to start honestly and start, even if, perfection is not yet attainable, you do need to make a starting point, and obviously explain what you're doing. And obviously in your annual report, there's that requirement to tick the box around SECR reporting, streamlined energy carbon reporting. And you obviously need to talk about the methods that you've used, the coefficients that you've used, and obviously things like DEFRA or the GHG protocol is a really good place to start. But also more so important, we would recommend that you also show stakeholders in your communications that you've got a journey to make, and also that you've got plans in place and plans afoot. And at present, no company is obviously capturing or reporting perfect data. And as a company changes or grows, acquires a new business, then they'll need to onboard that part of the organization as well. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please, for theme number 3? So this is really important. This is something that really resonated with me when I was in-house. It's about educating colleagues, collaborating to help build that internal buy-in. So the sort of, what's in it for me, for sure. So some leadership teams obviously have got an imperfect understanding of the climate sustainability issues, not least, they don't always have appreciation of how challenging and a fast-moving environment it is to actually get on top of what it is you actually need to collect. If you're going to subject yourself in due course to external scrutiny through assurance processes, for example, as is going to be starting to be a requirement of CSRD, then you need to have a methodology documented so it is subject to, or could be ready to be assured. An auditor won't be able to audit against something that is, you might have a lovely table about how you got to your numbers, but it's a bit like an exam. Sometimes if you can show you're working, then you've got a much better chance of being able to provide a robust picture of the plans that you've undertaken and how you've arrived there, rather than just, ta-da, here's your numbers. So as I mentioned before, some finance professionals seem to be still a little uncomfortable with the quote unquote often imperfect climate data that is out there, particularly when you're looking at value chain and the supply chain more generally and under scope 3. And interestingly, but this is what, certainly I found particularly rewarding and engaging, is that sustainability teams are often expected to bridge across those different departments. And it does give you almost a license to go out there, be curious, and actually bring those people together. And, for all of the challenges of collecting this data, it does mean that you've got an opportunity to break down those silos, improve communication, and generally, pull together as a business. So if we go to the next half of the slide, thank you. So there is certainly, from our point of view, there's certainly a culture shift that does need to take place in some organizations. And, if we think about the whole ethos of integrated reporting, it starts with integrated thinking, and that requires everybody to be on the same page with regards to seeing, the journey, the direction of travel that they require. So that early buy-in, internal buy-in is definitely crucial, to have the right resources, to have the right levers in place to actually make this happen. And there's definitely a role for educating and engaging with senior management on this. For many years ago, when I was in-house, what really drove the assurance process of some of the KPIs around climate and GHGs was that the audit partner at the time wanted to see an increased level of scrutiny, almost at the same level that the financial numbers would have been subjected to. And that really drove a behavior change and top management input and commitment to that. And finally, companies that lead in sustainability obviously do generally have a more engaged leadership, and you'll start to see that come through in some of the reporting and disclosure about those linkages between key teams, particularly sustainability practitioners, and you'll start to see the level of commitment that is there. You'll start to see more content go into chairman statements, into chief executive officer statements about the sustainability journey, the climate journey, and that is all evidence that the organization is taking it more seriously, is putting the right resources in place. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I guess, this comes back to that point before about the capacity of sustainability teams. So some of the thinking, some of the discussion rather at our event was that, increasingly there is more time spent on reporting than perhaps the doing. And most people who join the sustainability profession do so because they want to change the world. They want to make a contribution. And there is that sort of tension about, well, I want to do the doing, but I know I need to do the reporting. So being a sustainability practitioner now definitely requires a very broad range of skills and competencies, perhaps more so than when I joined the profession more than 20 years ago. And there is this sort of niggle for some people that there is this increased workload, this increased requirement of skills, and there is the possibility of, you know, being overloaded, which could ultimately result in burnout, and then people just become obviously disenchanted with what it is that they're trying to do. So the other part of the equation, if we go to the next part of this slide, thank you, is obviously a well-resourced team is essential, if not crucial, if the company wants to be successful on its journey. And because of as the slide that Leah showed earlier, because of the increasing volume, the increasing demands through new regulatory frameworks and disclosure requirements, teams are going to need to resource adequately. But obviously that's where organizations like ourselves have a role to play, and we're very happy to do that, to almost be an extension of the team to help, you know, provide that expertise, provide support to teams, something we've done obviously very successfully for a long time. But certainly when reporting is tackled across departments, then it's not just the sustainability people that are entirely responsible for getting that content, those numbers, that narrative out there. It generally requires those key obvious departments to come together, and this, you know, new regulation, new disclosure requirements can often bring those departments together. So I'm thinking of investor relations, corporate communications, company secretary, obviously finance, as I mentioned before. But certainly, and from a couple of the clients that we spoke to, increasingly there is like a bridging team between key finance people and key sustainability people, helping to try and relieve the collective pressure on some of those teams. And I've also, speaking to other clients, what tends to be happening in some quarters now is that the sustainability team, when it comes to pure reporting, have now got reporting lines that go to finance, rather than perhaps to a director of sustainability when it comes to that reporting and disclosure piece, which is quite interesting to see evolve. If we could go to the final theme slide, next slide, please. Thank you. So with regards to the frameworks, sort of the bigger picture that's going on, it is getting challenging. There is more reporting going to be required. And also there is a job to do to try and understand, as Leah alluded to, about the intersection of these different acronyms and these different frameworks and standards, and that is a role that obviously we're able to help clients with navigating what is sometimes referred to as that sort of alphabet soup of framework standards and reporting requirements. It can be hard to understand. This is what some of our clients at the roundtable told us. Hard to know which frameworks should they engage with, which ones should they prioritize. Some of them obviously are mandatory. Some of them may affect them depending on their listing status, on their size, and their organizational structure. Some of those frameworks may touch them slightly later in the time horizon. So this shifting landscape means sometimes it can feel, you know, sustainability team and practitioners who are at our event, there are people from other departments, but the sustainability people in particular did talk about the fact that, you know, it is difficult and challenging to keep up with this ever-shifting sands. So if we go to the next slide, please. Our next half of the slide, thank you. So, I mean, a lot of these frameworks are iterative. They tend to be evolving, and obviously part of the challenge for practitioners is because of the coming together or the integration of some of these frameworks and standards that has made it difficult to navigate, and we certainly recommend keeping on top of that. Obviously, there has been, I know it is a challenging time, but there has been a conscious effort by a lot of these regulators and framework standard setters to try and create alignment, to try and create a simplification. But it will get better, but we're not there yet. But also it is important, obviously, to apply and dedicate sufficient resources, headspace to keep up to date, because the required changes certainly will be challenging to engage with, but their help is out there. There are forums, there are organizations like ourselves that we can certainly help you. But it is a case of trying to keep on top of this and what is an increasing, you know, an evolving and fast moving environment. If we go to the next slide, and I think I'm going to hand back to Ellie to just provide some concluding remarks before we move into a Q&A.
Thanks, James. So basically, what I heard, and I thought, your presentation was super interesting and sort of going very, very deep into the detail and the challenges that sustainability teams face. If we take a sort of more wider and kind of sort of wider view across the team, and to talk about sort of some key actions and key practices. I think the most important thing is, as James said, is to start collecting the data early in very practical steps. There needs to be a baseline year that you start your analysis from, and within that, it is very important to keep following the regulatory or sort of, and of course we can help with that, but the developments out there, and thinking, and because I know I see some of the questions in the chat, and some of them are quite sort of technical, but it's almost in a way to think beyond that sort of regulatory requirement, which I understand is sort of the immediate goal and the pressing deadline, but thinking beyond that, how can we sort of explore the processes and systems and put them in place to support the data, even beyond the regulatory requirement. Next, thanks. I think, and James very firmly, I think we heard that in that roundtable, but also from the research that we have done, it's important to just start collecting the data and just reporting on the data, even if it's not perfect. There seems to be a clear friction between departments of sustainability and finance internally in many companies. James, you mentioned that very briefly. Finance departments will always, they come from a sort of completely different space and sort of practice where everything has to be specific, detailed, documented, and of course 100% accurate. But at the moment, this is not the case with climate data. There are many tools out there. I know there are also sort of a number of sort of technologies, spatial technology and things like that, that are trying to capture overall the emissions across the planet, and then sort of divided by country or sector or jurisdiction, and it's all sort of still work in progress. But for each company, it is just important to go into the detail, try to capture scope 1, scope 2, and of course scope 3, which is the more challenging and the more demanding aspect of the data collection, and just put it out there, even if that means that there are a few paragraphs or a few sort of sections that clearly explain that this is what we have so far. We are still trying to gather the data, just maybe sort of adding a few angles to this and a few sort of different perspectives. Even the sort of ESG raters and rankers, or even sort of benchmarks out there that evaluate climate among their different metrics, will sort of evaluate positively the openness and the sort of honesty and the authenticity of saying that we are still collecting this and this is imperfect and we are on a journey. And it's also, so that goes beyond the actual number of or the reduction of the emissions. So the faster companies sort of get into that mindset, and the faster they start collecting and reporting on that data, the more they are already ahead of the game. Next sort of column, thank you. I think the piece of education is something that we heard very, very clearly, and it's confirmed with our research. There is also recent sort of analysis which highlights how, for example, boards and senior leadership are not necessarily fully equipped with ESG skills or even sustainability skills. Very sort of bluntly, if you may, it is also often a generational thing. New generations and newer colleagues are much more passionate, much more informed about sustainability. They grew up in a different environment. Usually our boards and our senior leadership are much people that come from a different generation, and there is a mind shift that needs to happen there. So there isn't a piece of education. As James mentioned, of course, Black Sun can support with that and can be a sort of a third party or another voice that can add to that piece of education, and that sort of bring that sort of expertise of highlighting what are the key issues and bringing that perspective that this is already happening, and you know, you're already behind. But indeed, I think the education piece is very important to go upwards, downwards, and sideways. So it's not only about sort of education, certain other departments about the importance of collecting the data or bringing the specific elements that are required for meeting compliance and the regulatory requirement, but it is also about essentially campaigning and even sort of advocating for climate and sustainability itself to be part of the agenda. It is also important to sort of remind ourselves that, again, this is a process. So not everything happens overnight, and it takes persistence and insistence and sort of repetition to get there. Next part, please. This is something that we heard very, very clearly from many companies. We heard of sort of examples that went from a team of 2 to a team of sort of 10 or 15 people. And this is essentially, it comes down to the investment that a company does to that team to give it the tools and the resources that it requires to be able to sort of support and answer these challenges. Overall, it is, unfortunately, there is an element of reporting that takes away a lot of time from the overall actions. So, and this is the downside. I do know that, for example, even regulators and policymakers are very aware of the reporting burden for companies. And this falls, especially in terms of ESG and sustainability, it falls on the lap of the sustainability teams to just go back and report everything and just put it all on the paper for everyone to see. I do think that new technologies, I'm sure some of you have heard of sort of ChatGPT, new technologies can potentially be a tool to support with that and speed things up. And there are also trends which show that maybe in the future there could be much less sort of focus on bringing everything together on a report, and much more about having all the relevant information in various channels across a company's website. So it goes beyond the pure sort of report, but it is a much wider thing. So hopefully some of these trends will sort of enable much more time for action and for education and for actually moving the companies on a sustainability journey, and less about reporting to the rest of the world how they're moving on that journey. And last point, please. So it is a very fast-moving landscape. I think we all agree to that. And it is very exhausting to keep up with everything that is happening. However, it is important to remember that the new frameworks that are coming out, excuse me, the new frameworks that are coming out tend to align with existing frameworks. There is a tendency across with the EU regulations, with ISSB, even in Asia, to bring everything together. So, for example, in Asia, we see that there is an adoption of TCFD. There are many exchanges across Africa and across Latin America that, again, are adopting parts of TCFD, and also at the higher level of sort of standards and regulations internationally, there is that push for alignment. So it's coming from regulators, it's coming from policymakers, it's coming from civil society, and of course from companies themselves. So hopefully Blackstone can help you cut through the noise and give you clear guidance on what is relevant and important for your own company. But it is important to also remember that each framework is building on previous. And again, in a way, it is important to maybe sort of take a step back and think beyond what is the regulatory requirement and more about where the company is trying to get to in terms of its sustainability journey. And I believe with that, we have reached our Q&A. So we have a few questions. Let me just quickly
we've
gather.
got a first one. Somebody's very interested to know a little bit more about the Transition Plan Task Force. That was the first question, which I think, Leah, you were going to
happy to take that?
briefly respond to.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for context, the question is, can you please confirm that it is required to disclose and set targets for all scopes under Transition Plan Task Force? And the answer is yes, according to the TPT disclosure framework and also the implementation guidance, which are both online. Indeed, when asking to describe the strategic ambition of an entity's transition plan by disclosing its objectives and priorities, this should include interim and long targets to reduce GHG emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. The second question still of this attendee is if Shell companies present their decarbonization plan focus on the material relevant emissions. And also the answer is yes. According to TPT, a plan that is to be disclosed needs to include any transition relevant actions that are material to the entity's long-term enterprise value. Lastly, about what sector-specific guidance will be released by summer 2023. The information we have so far, and that was disclosed by the TPT task force, was that this will be published in summer 2023. They just said there is a sector guidance that will be published. The only thing I think we can advance in a way, if we were to look at sector standards that were, for example, released by the GRI framework, this was oil and gas, coal, mining, financial services, textile. So if we were to think that these ESG frameworks are coming together, I would say that these could be some of the sectors that are covered, but so far the TPT hasn't disclosed what sectors are being covered. So thank you very much for the question. And then I think I have a second one, which is from your viewpoint, are there standards or frameworks companies should be focusing on most immediately? As we've seen also in the regulatory landscape that we presented, but also what TPT has been saying so far, both TCFD and ISSB are two key frameworks that will help prepare for disclosures that are needed. The TCFD, also because it's already mandatory in the UK, for example, and definitely covers how companies are tackling climate opportunities and climate risks under the 4 pillars, in accordance also with the ISSB, which so far we have an exposure draft for general disclosures, but another one for climate-related risks. Both of them are going to be key to then respond to the TPT. There are expectations that the UK might replace the requirements that the TCFD right now imposes and actually make it a mandatory for transition plans. So these two, I would say, are definitely key to then help build your transition plan. And over to you, James. Do you have, I think, another question?
Yeah, somebody was asking a question about ESOS, which I will happily give a thumbnail sketch of. So first of all, an apology, the deadline for phase 3 is actually the 5th of December, not the 31st. Previous 2 phases have ended on New Year's Eve 2015, followed by New Year's Eve 2019. But for phase 3, the current phase, you'll need to submit your required documentation by the 5th of December. So the question related to specifically, we're a FTSE 100 business, but we only limited operations in the UK, mainly outside of the UK. Will we still need, or will we be captured? Well, so refreshing everyone's memory about ESOS, obviously this is derived from the Energy Performance Directive from the EU. Obviously was created as a UK statute some years ago. First phase ended, as I mentioned before, December 2015. So if you're described in the requirements as a large undertaking, as at the 31st of December 2022, which is the qualification period for this phase, you will need to make a disclosure. And a large undertaking is any UK company that employs 250 or more people and has an annual turnover in excess of £44 million and an annual balance sheet total in excess of £38 million. So I suspect that if you're a FTSE 100, you'll absolutely be captured by that. But I would suggest that you might seek some specialist advice about ESOS to ensure that you can meet the criteria and the required qualification deadline. There are some specifics that probably require some further thought and interpretation around the exact reporting periods and about which you need to use a 12-month period. Obviously, you need to be measuring your energy and your total consumption. You need to be using common units. I mean, the whole point about ESOS was putting energy as a topic onto the boardroom table, because if you can cast your mind back to 2014, 2015, energy generally made up a much smaller percentage of a company's cost base than regrettably, and for many obvious reasons, it does now. So some organizations will need to think about starting to get organized, making sure that they've obviously got a report that's prepared that will need to be checked by a lead assessor who is obviously has to have certain capabilities and competencies to do that. And obviously, the sooner you start, if you've not already done so, the better. So I hope that answers that question. And just before I hand back to Ellie to have a look at what other questions have come in, there was a question about when we talk about data, were we principally referring to Scope 1 and Scope 2 and 3, or are we seeing a clear shift towards providing robust information on physical risks, opportunities in their relation to financial performance? So I guess I could answer that by, and just for clarity, so when we talk about Scope 1 GHG emissions, we're talking about the direct use of solid, liquid or gaseous types of fossil fuels, so natural gas, or petroleum, gasoline, or diesel, whatever you call it, wherever you may be based. Scope 2, we're talking about the direct use of typically grid electricity. And then Scope 3 generally is the value chain emissions. It's the upstream and downstream emissions from your products or services that are created to produce, transport, move around, etc. Those products and services in Scope 3. So yes, we are principally talking about Scope 1, Scope 2, and obviously at present it's a mandatory requirement to publish your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions data. Has been for some years under mandatory carbon reporting, and then obviously strengthened under the streamlined energy carbon reporting requirements. So that is something that generally has to be in your director's report of your annual report. Most disclosing organizations will cross-refer to have the detail in their dedicated sustainability section, where they'll have a table. You obviously have to report your UK emissions, your rest of world emissions, and then your total emissions. You need to be talking about your energy efficiency activities you've undertaken during the year. You need to talk about your methodology, the frameworks you've used, the coefficients, etc. In answering the second part, are you seeing a clear shift towards providing robust information on physical risk opportunities? Well, I guess if you're a large organization and either due to being on the front foot or responding to stakeholder pressure, you possibly participated in the Carbon Disclosure Project framework for some time. Obviously, the CDP process has been around for 2 decades now. And obviously that was about trying to bring the conversation together between the investment community and disclosures and preparers of corporate climate information, both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. And obviously TCFD has really ratcheted this up around fiscal risks and opportunities. And there is a requirement to talk about how you are approaching scenario analysis in your TCFD disclosures. And obviously CDP is almost moving in step, or has moved in step with TCFD in recent times, and ask you to disclose your key physical risks or opportunities, and the same with transition risks and opportunities. And obviously increasingly companies are looking to try and put a financial quantification on top of, as an extra layer, on those principal risks and opportunities through a climate lens, particularly whether they be transition or physical. So, and the other final part of the question is the gap on transition plans and how they relate to business strategy. Well, I mean, arguably you'd like to see it increasingly becoming much more intertwined and, integrated. But there's obviously still some way to go there. And the whole reason that the TPT was created was when the UK had the COP presidency, and when the UK hosted COP26 in Glasgow, November of 2021, about trying to close that gap and to create more harmony and integration. So I hope that answers your question. And Ellie, I'll hand back to you to review the other questions that we've got in our remaining 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, James.
I think there was a question about CSRD, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I can
please
take
could
that
you
one.
share some insights on how others are preparing for the upcoming CSRD requirements?
Yeah. So the question is, please could you share some insights on how others are preparing for the upcoming CSRD requirements? So CSRD being the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is a European regulation, although we know that it might have impact for companies that actually have not only operations in Europe, but also that exceed the threshold of asset under management or turnover. I would say that some of the ways that we're helping our clients address preparedness for CSRD is to actually look across the reporting suite and see how are we using different ESG frameworks that are somehow related to the requirements of CSRD. So we know some of the important topics are, for example, covering double materiality. So we can look at your peers and how are you actually tackling the fact that you need to look at the risks for your business, but also the impacts on society and the environment, more than just a single materiality, so known as the financial materiality. So that's one of the things, helping our clients sometimes either refresh their materiality assessment and see how this is being covered. Also making sure that you have third-party assurance. So it's one of the things that if you don't, we then advise our clients to do so, because it's one of the requirements. And also looking at your current reporting of E, S, and G topics, how much is this actually aligned with the new European sustainability reporting standards? So the EFRAG as an entity has put together already draft disclosures. We have 5 standards for environmental topics, 4 social standards, and 1 governance standard. So also figure out what's the alignment that you already have with these specific topics, and specifically about sectors. We have indeed already drafted standards for agriculture, coal, mining, road transportation, motor vehicle production, textiles, and food and beverage will now be covered amongst other 31 sectors. So we are helping our clients understand, with the information that we have so far, how long or how far are you from this? So I guess this is one of the things that we are helping to bring more clarity about. I don't know if there's other questions.
I think we covered most everything. I see some repetition about the date for the TPT, and it's just summer. We don't have a more specific date. And I think we've answered all the questions about CSRD.
Maybe good to know that we might follow up by email if people want to actually have answers. We can also follow up by email, although some of them I can see that maybe they're anonymous.
but very sort of practically, just
Mm-hmm.
to for those who joined late, we will be sending this recording round to everyone, including people who had signed up and were not able to join. Please reach out to us if you have any more questions, but also potentially to just have a short call about how Black Sun or our team in particular sort of can support. I saw a question earlier on about how we can bridge the gap between the different teams. And I think we mentioned earlier on that sometimes bringing someone external to sort of bring that viewpoint and that expertise and knowledge of the sector and the development sort of helps with internal sort of advocacy or sort of building a case for certain things. And with that, I will let you get on with your day or your afternoon and evening. I hope you have a great rest of the day and a productive week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.